case studies where you ask women, well, have you ever been, say, in a supermarket and you felt suddenly that your baby needed you and you called home and your intuition was correct? And of course, many women have that experience.
You are tuning in to the Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
That'd be an interesting conversation. That would be another rabbit hole we could go down. Is that an equal responsibility? Because women are kind of associated with emotions and men are kind of less.
I kind of would be interested in going down the rabbit hole. One thing I want to add to this conversation, which I think is really important, is the biggest gender bias in hiring that they found is with mothers and fathers. Because when you have single childless people, the gender bias is there, but it's smaller. But when they send out resumes, like the same study, when they send out resumes, one with a male name, one with a female name, they're all the same. But they have something on the resume indicating the person's a parent, like PTA involvement. There's a massive penalty for mothers, and there's a small boost for fathers. So mothers, this is again identical resumes. Mothers were offered on average 11,000 less than childless women and 13,000 less than fathers.
Yeah. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with, it's not necessarily that they think the women are doing a worse job. I think it has to do with that they think the women are more of a risk.
Yeah, I agree. More of a risk, won't work as hard. There's some level of bias, probably, maybe a level of moralizing. But.
Yeah, well, and I mean, just think about it. Anecdotally, there's probably studies on this, I'm sure. But I think if we all think to our own childhoods and personal experiences, if you were homesick, like more often than not, it's the mom that takes off work to care for you, right? That's usually the default in a two-parent household is moms usually handle most of the kid things or child emergencies and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly how it worked in my family.
Did you guys have, I guess you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but did you guys have working parents or both parents working, or was there a stay at home?
My mom stayed at home. My dad worked. We also had a 4-kid family.
Both my parents worked, but my mom worked less. Like my dad had more of a career. My mom had several jobs over the years.
My dad worked full time and my mom worked part-time, flexible hours when I was young. And then when I was 8 or 9, she went back to college and then worked full time.
Yeah, my mom did not work when I was a kid, but she had us pretty young. So when I was 12, she went back to work and she was still in her 30s. So it was still a reasonable time for her to launch a career. Not that any age is reasonable to launch a career, but
right.
If you do it fairly, younger is generally a benefit.
Age bias would be another thing that we didn't do any of the research on this, but age discrimination is a big, that's a big deal as well in hiring.
People have all sorts of different biases for different innate qualities.
Yes. That's a big one. Yeah, that would be a rabbit hole though. Do you want to go down that? Do you want to go down that rabbit hole of motherhood versus fatherhood and responsibility? Are women more of a risk?
I mean, so I think you talked about having anecdotes and you talked about having statistics, but I think you also have evolutionary biology. Right. So if you look at the history of our our race, I guess before agriculture, in hunter-gatherer societies, the men were tasked generally with going out and hunting and warring and being sort of away from the home and taking care of things and making sure that the home was safe, but basically not spending as much time with the kids as the mom. Whereas the mom and the women in the society were more tasked with gathering food and staying closer to the house and taking care of the children. So, and that's, we were hunter-gatherers for a large majority of our history. So it's pretty, I would say it's pretty evident that is built into our genetic makeup at this point.
One interesting thing, like these evolutionary biology stories, or you got to be a little bit careful about them too, because it's easy to come up with like just so stories. Like you can construct a story for anything you want to support in some ways, but it's still, I think there's value in it. Like it constrains some of our explanations. But one thing I find interesting, like looking back at the hunter-gatherer thing, is there's almost, I think this argument originated with Marx, but there's an argument that like in hunter-gatherer times, if you look at where the food came from, the men were bringing home a lot of the hunting, whereas the women were gathering. And so you had both the males and the females bringing in food. And in a lot of places, it was differed regionally, but in a lot of places, most of the calories came from gathering. The women were bringing home the bulk of the food. Mm-hmm. Then you get into agricultural society. And in agricultural societies, it functions very differently. Like for one aspect of agricultural societies is you can't have a pregnant woman operate a draft animal, because she'll have like a pregnant woman operating a draft animal has like a 1 1/3 chance of miscarriage. So it's a very bad idea. So you get a situation where basically the men are doing all the farming, bringing home all the food, and the only role that remains to women is taking care of the children. Like Chris pointed out, most of our evolutionary history, we were hunter-gatherers, like a vast majority of it, and agriculture is a relatively new technology. It changed a lot of things, but it's a more complex argument than what I'm making out. But for various reasons in agricultural society, the argument is agricultural society is what led to the inevitability of the subordination of women. Like in hunter-gatherer societies, some of them were very patriarchal, some of them were very egalitarian, whereas in agricultural societies, it's inevitable that women take on a status that's closer to that of property than what was the case in hunter-gatherer societies. And it's interesting because now we exist in a time where we're not really a primarily agricultural society anymore. Like we still are, like our food still comes from agriculture, but only a very small proportion of the population needs to work in agriculture. So in a way, and that's where you see women returning to the workforce and women returning to being producers in a really big way that didn't really exist since hunter-gatherer times.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Our labor is no longer entirely physical. So these physical advantages that men have in hard labor are no longer so relevant. And it does not seem to be the case that men have big cognitive or any cognitive advantages, really.
Right. It definitely seems that there was this sort of biological division of labor in hunter-gatherer times, which was exacerbated by agriculture, which sort of required this separation of labors, where since it was dangerous for pregnant women to work in the fields, and they were already sort of tasked with taking care of the children, then that's what they ended up doing. And then now that we're in this modern era where most people don't need to work in fields, and it's absolutely cool for a pregnant woman to do just about any, knowledge work, maybe not construction work or something like that, but there's probably the vast majority of jobs out there are not more dangerous for pregnant women to do than just the average person.
There's another aspect to this too, though. It's not just can women work and can women be good providers and are women suitable to being providers, but there's also the question of the special relationship between a mother and a baby. Mothers feed babies from their own bodies. There's evidence that women react differently to the sound of a baby crying than men do. Their brains light up more. I think that there is maybe honestly, I think there is a special bond and also some practical reasons that if you're going to have a parent stay home to be the child caregiver, at least in the early years, it makes some natural sense for it to be the mom. You can have it in reverse. You can have the mom go to work and do like breast milk pumping or use formula, but I think that there's some natural advantages to it being the woman who's the primary caregiver, at least in those early years, and then that momentum probably stays.
There's also evidence of a psychic connection between mother and child, where the milk lets down when the child is hungry.
That's actually really interesting. Can you like maybe elaborate a little bit, Kurt?
Okay, so they did some experiments about it where they tried to tell. I think the mother would record when her milk let down and when she had a feeling like, oh, my baby needs me, and at that point they're normally accurate. And so there's also I guess it was based around more anecdotal or case studies where you ask women, well, have you ever been, say, in a supermarket and you felt suddenly that your baby needed you and you called home and your intuition was correct? And of course, many women have that experience.
My mom anecdotally has told me that many times. Like, oh, I just had ESP. So maybe there's a biological basis for that.
My mom has told me some similar things. I'm so skeptical of things like that, but I don't want to just discount so many people's experience either. But even on like a pure, not speculative, not anecdotal level, the content of breast milk changes not only like throughout the course of the baby's development, like with different makeup and, you know, different amounts of breast milk being produced, but also the amount and like the fat composition will change throughout the day and throughout the feeding. And I don't know how much has been looked into the advantages of actually breastfeeding as opposed to bottle feeding with breast milk. I know there's lots of advantages of breastfeeding over formula feeding, but it seems like it's not just like you can pump breast milk and then feed it at any time and it's the same. It seems like there's something about the in the moment connection between the mother and the baby that actually changes.
There has to be some kind of rhythm or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a really rough question because, like, on one hand, like, it's really rough because there really does seem to be a lot of advantages to, especially little children, of having a parent around, and it does seem like there is a special relationship with the mother in a way, but it's rough because, like, it's hard to see how that wouldn't affect the career. Like, I want to say that stuff like daycare in the offices, like, it seems like talking about this hunter-gatherer thing, like, one way to approximate it in modern times could be like having women work in such a way where they're in closer proximity to the children as a gatherer would in primordial times. But it's really tough. It's really tough with knowledge work. I mean, one thing that happens when a woman becomes pregnant is she loses a little bit of her cognitive ability too, which is a thing to keep in mind, but it comes back after.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that.
It's a baby brain. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a friend who has little children and it's really, really tough. Like, it's like kind of a constant cognitive load to take care of them. And it seems like, especially in the modern world where so much of our work is cognitively demanding, it seems like it would be really tough to like I know that like I can't write an article if I'm interrupted at all. I get really irritated at people, but I can't imagine writing a thing where I'm being interrupted every 10 seconds.
And also your level of neuroticism goes up. That's one of the personality changes that tends to take place like during pregnancy and when you become a mother. I think you become more tuned to really pay attention to these interruptions because these are like the most important little tiny interruptions in the world and they're happening constantly all the time.
Maybe like daycare in the workplace. Like maybe if there was a workplace and it had a daycare actually in the workplace. So there was someone watching the children. So you could go do a task and like focus on it, but then you could come back and check in on your children pretty frequently. So it's not like they didn't feel like I know there's studies that children who are in daycare, there's sometimes like a sense of abandonment. So it could help alleviate that.
Right. And hunter-gatherer societies were like villages, right? Where maybe not all of them, but, you know, small communities where it wasn't necessarily just a household, right? With a man and a woman and some children and that's it, you know, and then the parents leave and go to work and just leave their kids, you know, somewhere. There was this kind of community where maybe the grandparents could take over when the parents were busy, or maybe the sisters and the cousins and the friends, all of those people could chip in and help raise the kids. Of course, the mother is still the primary caregiver, but if she needs to not be distracted while doing something, she can do that.
The role of the grandmother and the community probably predated the role of the father, actually. The role of the grandmother almost certainly did. Like, for a lot of human history, they didn't track who the father was so much.
I was just going to say too, being that we're from the US, Canada, and Australia, we're actually kind of unique in the world in like this 2-parent household model. I think in most of the world, people are much more likely to live in multi-generational homes where the grandparents are there during those early child rearing years. And a lot of times they play a huge role. And I don't think that, I doubt, I don't know, I haven't looked into research on it, but I doubt that children feel the same sense of abandonment being cared for by grandma than going to some kind of a daycare institution with 30 kids and 2 20-somethings being paid $9 an hour.
Yeah, and that's another argument in favor of having kids younger, which also can really impact the career. But like, my parents had me in their 20s, and like when I was a little kid, my grandparents were in their 50s and 60s, so they had plenty of energy and they could have us over for sleepovers and stuff, and they were very involved. And I look at them now in their 80s, like if we were little kids, they wouldn't be able to do very much to take care of us.
Yeah. There are also alternatives too, though, like yet another anecdote. But I did go to daycare as a child when my mom was working part-time. I didn't feel any kind of sense of abandonment at all. But the daycare that I went to was a small daycare that was run by a mom, and it was me and her kids and like 2 other kids. And it was very much, she was friends of the family, and it was a home style environment. I didn't mind going over there at all. I thought it was awesome.
Yeah. And I wonder if, going back to the grandmother thing, like, I wonder if having somebody be closely biologically related to you if there are advantages to that than just having some sort of stranger taking care of you.
Maybe. I mean, I think it certainly depends on the stranger, though, you know. I think that we would all be better off if we were living a little bit more like a community. Maybe we don't need to be living in community houses, but friends helping each other babysit, pitching in, family members being more around. I don't think that the way that many people are doing it now, where women just go home and then are completely alone with a baby for 6 months and then go back to work, and then the baby goes into some kind of facility. I don't think that's anywhere close to ideal.
Doesn't seem healthy.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't seem healthy to me. But that doesn't mean that women can't work or that all the burden should be on the mom, but maybe we shouldn't be living in such isolation.
Yeah, I think definitely communities that are based on actual effective connections and not commerce is important. Because like, I mean, at a very basic level, like, your family probably is going to love you. Like, there's something biologically happens when it's like your child or your niece or your grandchild, like, and you kind of not, sometimes people don't love their own children, which is tragic, but they almost always do. People almost always love their own children, and people very, very, very often love their children who are related to them. But if it's like a random stranger who you're paying, they are probably not going to love your child. Or they're going to love your child a very small portion of the time.
In a very different way.
There are a lot of scandals out there with daycare workers have been caught beating the children and this kind of thing. Makes you worry.
Yes. On the other hand, though, I do want to point out, though, that the most likely person to abuse your child is like a parent or a family member. And family is important and family is a good thing, but also child abuse is extremely common. And I don't think that people should just automatically bring in their parents or assume that their parents or their siblings would be good caregivers. You know, you hear a lot of, not only do you hear a lot of stories, but like most cases of child abuse and child molestation are within the family itself. And I don't think that we should discount friendships or chosen family in this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the biological connection thing is certainly maybe an advantage at first, but obviously, yeah, just having somebody who's trusted and who spends a large portion of the child's life with the child is, could potentially even be better than the parent, depending on if the parent is not a very good parent.
Yeah. And I think once kids get older, like I think going off into an institution or going off into like a community setting outside of the family is also extremely important. Like school. I think school is really important for kids.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I
think
question. I know some people don't like school, but
school is done really weird.
School's tough. I think it just really, really depends on the school. I would agree with you though, that I think getting out of the house with your peer group, with adults who are not your parents, and being in something that's different and more independent is important. Whether that's school or something else could be a debate. I'm not anti-school. I actually had a really good experience in public school. I know maybe I'm a rarity there, but I think you can do that without school also.
Yeah, and I'm not anti-school or anything. I just think that the large majority of school could probably be done better.
It's almost like school or not. It's almost at a certain point in a kid's life, there's like a hero's journey that has to take place. Like there's a certain stage where it's really important. It seems like it's really important for the kid to be around like loving, trusting people and to have, again, like not to generalize because some family is like really dysfunctional and stuff. And some kids need to be separated from their mothers for various reasons. But I think in general, that is ideal to be close to a close family when they're really little. And then when they get a little bit older, like probably like 6, I think 6 probably is a pretty good age for them to like go on a hero's journey and go outside the family and be around other children and to like struggle a little bit. And
yeah. Boy Scouts was really important in my life, I would say. I think that helped me a lot.
I tend to think that from the beginning, I think being in more of a community than just in a tight-knit family would be better. And this isn't based on any kind of studies, but it is kind of based on maybe my vision of how humans evolved for the most part, like living in hunter-gatherer tribes or living in communities. I think that it would be healthier to have more adult influences and to have kids just outside of your own sibling group around more often. To mainly socialize with not just your parents day to day, but to be in some kind of a setting with multiple families, I think would be amazing.
People who you see a lot, people who you see enough to form a real connection with.
Yes, but real connections more than just your family unit. I think that would be good for moms too, and maybe you could have then. I don't know. I a lot of times think about single moms because there's so many single moms in the world, and I know it would be difficult to do this, but I think it would be great to see more single moms team up and help each other, like watch each other's kids while one goes back to work, etc.
I wonder why people aren't doing that more. Maybe they just. It does seem like a little bit of a challenge.
They say from an evolutionary biology perspective again, like I'm sorry to keep going back to the evolutionary biology, but they say that that's probably a big part of the reason why, you can question this from so many levels, it's very controversial. They say it's a big part of the reason why women are more likely to be bisexual than men, or why women are more sexually fluid, because in like primordial times, again, like there was very, like they think that there was probably not a situation where it was like pair bonding, and then there was a lot of, especially in the very early times before people really separated into different cultures, it was probably, there was not always a clear paternity to children. It was maybe more the males like providing for the whole community or helping out all the kids, and there wasn't so much the focus of 2 parents on one child. So they say it was probably like a lot of like same-sex relationships between women that were like basically teaming up to raise their children together.
It seems very plausible to me. We're veering a little bit off topic here, but I think this is interesting. when you're talking about human happiness, one of the biggest predictors for human happiness and also longevity, like as much as diet and exercise, is strong community ties. Not just pair bonding ties, but strong community ties.
I would believe that.
It's tough.
It seems like one way to look at it could be like in our culture, there's a lot of focus on commerce and economic activity and on succeeding as an individual, but there's not a lot of focus on community and on children. So it ends up being the role of taking care of children just becomes a very low status economic job instead of it being something that a lot of people are contributing to communally.
I think it's also reflected in the way that elderly people are treated. Like it's like we ship the children off to the daycare and we ship the elderly off to the elderly care, and everybody, yeah, like Ariel said, it's like everybody who is, or when the focus is on the economic activity. So if children can't do their economic stuff and the elderly can't, well, just, forget about them, put them in an institution. And it was interesting talking to our friend Seamus about this. He lived in Zambia for a long time, and he said that one of the reasons that in the West people have less children is because they're not economically viable, whereas in a lot of parts of Africa, say a woman is a housekeeper and she'll come in with her children, and these children are like 5 years old, but they'll already be working. They'll already be helping out, sweeping the floor or something like that. And that's that's a factor too.
I that's actually what I was going to say. I was going to say, I think it's weird how we draw this line at 18 and we say, you're an adult now, stop learning, start doing stuff, and I think it should be much more gradual than that. I think it should be kind of like, oh, you're 5, you can carry stuff, like you can't be the CEO of a company, but you can certainly, kind of gradually build up your skills and responsibilities until you are taking huge amounts of responsibility and solving all sorts of big problems.
Sounds like age discrimination to me, Chris.
Absolutely.
Sounds like child labor to me.
Absolutely.
It's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us on the Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.